we are an intimate group. Welcome, I'm Sunny Fass. I'm in the dark, but that's okay, you can still see me, I shine. I'm Sunny Fass, I'm the Executive Director of Lotus. Thank you so much for being here. This is technically, I think, our first official event of the festival. So thank you for joining us. I hope that you all either picked up one of the broadsheets or you have one at home. We do have plenty here if you want to use it to follow along and take notes from the presentation tonight to help you decide how to plan your festival. The festival is September 15th through the 18th. Tickets are on sale. There's a ton of information on our website, and of course we hope to see you all there. Tonight's presentation, I'd like us to thank, first of all, the Monroe County Public Library for hosting us. And then also our speaker tonight and is from our sponsor, the IU Department of Folklore and Ethnomusicology. It's a wonderful, wonderful synergy between Lotus and the Ethnomusicology Department at IU for many years now. It is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Dr. David MacDonald is, in fact, the director of the Ethnomusicology Institute, and I'm really excited to hear what he has to say. David.
Okay, there we are. Thank you, Sunny. I'm really happy to be here tonight. This is perhaps my favorite event that occurs every year in Bloomington. When I first moved here 8 years ago, I didn't know what Lotus was, and then one day I left work and noticed the entire streets were overcome with people running around, and it was a revelation. Since that time, Lotus has been absolutely my favorite weekend of the year. More than a fan, I'm an enthusiast. I'm like a screaming schoolgirl running through the streets. Any ethnomusicologist, anyone interested in world music, anyone just wanting to be out and about, this weekend is great for all of those reasons. So tonight, I'm going to put on my ethnomusicologist hat a little bit and talk a little bit about some of the artists that are coming out to see us, and in particular try to draw some threads through and talk about some themes that I've noticed with regards to the various musical groups that are coming. I very much, however, invite your commentary, your thoughts, your ideas, your questions. So at any time, if something comes up and you want to know more about it, or if I leave something out, or you have a question, just please shout it out. This is a community, really collaborative conversation I want us to have. Perhaps the main theme that I came away with when I looked through this was roots and roots. How do I take a look at all of the different artists that are coming for this event? How can I, in some way, package them for our discussion today? And roots is what I came up with. Music and mobility might be another good one. But a lot of the artists that we're talking about, they're coming here and they're displaying kind of their roots, their traditional roots. And what I mean by tradition is the kind of practices that they draw from the past in order to create the desired future, as well as the roots that music or those traditions take as they travel around the world, both in terms of how people travel and as well as how ideas or media travel. As a kind of a thought experiment, I started drawing connections between the places on the set list of artists that are coming. After about 10 minutes, I gave up because it just got too complicated, actually. Every group is coming from a certain place, moving towards another place, and all of it ending up here in Indiana. We have 33 featured artists that are coming, representing 28 nations. I put an asterisk there because the word nation doesn't really work oftentimes with Lotus, because these are, of course, musicians that perhaps they are part of diaspora communities themselves, meaning they bring forth traditions from an ancestral homeland into a new place of residency, but then they're also meeting and collaborating and cooperating. They're adapting and appropriating musics from all over the world and creating something new. The word nation doesn't really work here. The word state doesn't really work here because the borders become so porous when we're talking about the movement of both people and music. So then I thought, well, what might be another way in which we could somehow package or think about the Lotus Fest? And if we can't do it geographically, like if I tried to do Let's talk about the Latin American groups, and then let's talk about the Asian groups, and then let's talk about the Sub-Saharan groups. It really breaks down because, like I said, the aesthetic boundaries, they don't work when you're talking about groups that draw from multiple traditions. So I thought, how else might we be able to think about the Lotus Fest? And I came up with this notion of spectacle, this notion of contemplation, fusion, doing, and connecting. And these are, of course, abstract concepts, and they might be a little woo-woo for many of us, but many of the groups that we find, if we take a look at the performances at Lotus, you have some that are far more intimate, taking place in the church, where you have presentational classical art musics performed for a small audience, very contemplative events where your role is to kind of absorb and listen and perhaps learn. But then we have these spectacular events that occur on the main stages, right? And that's where spectacle becomes the thing that draws us in. Seeing the connections, seeing the kind of craziness, dancing, screaming loudly, being a part of this huge environment. Go to Movitz and you'll see what I mean by spectacle. Fusion. This is another aspect of the Lotus Fest. So there are some groups that are roots, meaning they're from a particular place, and there are some groups that are roots, and they are the movement of people through places. And that's where I get fusion from. And a lot of the groups, fusion becomes the thing that draws us towards them. Seeing how Afro-Colombian music can be mixed with EDM, seeing how Bhangra percussion can be mixed with British fiddle tunes. These kinds of connections, seeing how Lithuanian zither traditions can be matched up with Senegalese kora playing. All of that kind of fusion aspect is another thing that alerts us to really unique musical collaborations that take place. And then doing and connecting. Doing, you have these very participatory events. The Arts Village, for example, the parade down Kirkwood. These are the things that the participatory events that get everybody involved, where the community kind of becomes part of the attraction. And then connecting, I have as kind of an overriding theme, where we have these more community-based events that take place beforehand and during the days. I'm going to start, however, with one of the things after I came up with these concepts is I realized, okay, I have 33 groups to look at. I have these 5 different abstract concepts to think about, and I have 1 hour, and I'm supposed to leave time for Q&A. Okay, so that's not going to happen, right? I had to kind of take it like a salad bar and pick and choose certain artists to talk about. There's no way I can get to all of them. So some of the more obvious artists, I'm not going to talk about. Movitz, I'm not going to talk about Movitz. Altan, I'm not going to talk about Altan, because those are the more obvious ones. I want to kind of dig out and talk about the groups that perhaps might be new to our community and might present interesting collaborations for us to talk about. So I'm going to talk about first this notion of spectacle. And these are the 4 groups that I pulled out of spectacle that I want to definitely highlight. The first is, of course, Pumba, who I'm now an absolute fan of. I want to start by playing a little bit of their music for you. And then we'll talk about kind of where they come from. I'm going to back up just a Okay, so what are we hearing here? Well, we know Mukumba is actually from Zimbabwe, but this is not the kind of Zimbabwe you're perhaps used to hearing. Mukumba is actually from a minority group called the Tonga on the Zambian-Zimbabwe border near Bulawayo and Victoria Falls. The great thing about them, you'll notice we have heavy dance beats, right? Heavy hip-hop beats. But on top of that, we have Afro-Congolese guitar playing. The sound is, of course, hip-hop, but it also draws specifically from Afro-pop. If we could make like a set list of what Lotus is, it would be very difficult to do, but in many ways they overlap in some form of transnational pop music. And this group, Mukumba, brings together 3 or 4 different traditions in really unique ways. This is one of my favorites though, Palenque Soul Tribe. Here we have, like I was speaking earlier, the Afro-Colombian music with EDM. EDM stands for electronic dance music. Pay attention to the way that the melodies interact with the soundscapes behind them, the beats. Okay, we have EDM beats along with a trap set. Then we have Afro-Colombian percussion. I can tell you this group is going to do really well with our fans of Lotus. And then of course we have the EDM dance break. So what are the roots we're hearing here? I mean, this notion of Afro-Colombian popular music has been part of the kind of global imagination for some time. The moving DJ equipment and moving EDM, moving electronic dance music as a background to it is a really logical and in fact normal occurrence when we think about the movement of these sounds through popular musicscapes. Afro-Colombian music has become internationalized in many ways. Situating it on top of an EDM framework is really common. I mean, if you remember, I think it was last year, the year before, there's a great band called Delhi to Dublin that came and did the exact same thing, except they used Bhangra sounds and Irish traditional fiddle playing on top of an EDM format. So here we have this notion of EDM as being one of the kind of the structures upon which you have traditional music placed on top of it. And Rafiq Qawali seems really interesting to me, not necessarily because of the musical aspect, but I wanted to single him out specifically because of the kind of social and political aspects of his music. Okay, where would you think that Rafiq is from, right? Listen to the beat and the guitar part, the rhythm guitar part. It's just standard, straight up reggae. Rafiq's actually from Ghana, however. And his music, well, he's singing about Nairobi, I don't know why, but his music is very active politically, and he uses a lot of his sound specifically as a format for political protest, where reggae actually becomes quite a natural setting for those political sentiments. If there's another one of these overlapping themes that we find in Lotus, especially in the main stages, it's just heavy pounding bass, which is now a conceit of world popular music in general. Heavy bass is the thing that often draws cosmopolitan audiences, especially ones like ours. This is an interesting thing, though, that ethnomusicologists often grapple with. We can talk about the various musical traditions and where they come from around the world, and we can talk about their histories and their developments, their movements and appropriations and influences. But make no mistake about it, the music that is brought to Lotus is first and foremost music that would be seen as appropriate, interesting, enjoyable for a Midwestern American cosmopolitan audience, right? And for that reason, you find a lot of the same kind of musical structures, whether that band is from Zimbabwe or Colombia or anywhere else. You certainly find, especially on the main stages, you find that spectacular notion of global pop, which, even though the languages might be different, the musical settings are often very similar. And the similarities there are a reflection of what might be considered transnational aesthetics, or the kinds of music that people around the world of similar cohorts and similar formations all listen to. There is an exception, however, in Lotus, and the exception is when we move away from the main stages and you go into the more intimate settings. that's when you really have the opportunity to dig into the so-called roots, the ROOTS, of indigenous musical traditions around the world, the kind of off the beaten path performers, the ones that don't necessarily fall into the world beat or global pop framework, but rather present more indigenous instrumentation and performance styles. And that's where I came into contemplation as my next kind of abstract concept for thinking about the Lotus Fest. In these events, we often find more, what I would say, rich, different, far afield musical aesthetics than what we are typically used to or accustomed to hearing here in the States. And the Union is the one that I wanted to draw out first, mostly because they are a Mongolian group that also draws from, in their repertory, a lot of tube and throat singing. What are we hearing here? We have spiked fiddle orchestra, vocals, and loud percussion, accenting poetry to text. The refrain is then using deep tube and throat singing. What we can tell from this sociologically is that this music is part of a bardic tradition of storytelling, where these performers actually become repositories of public knowledge. They tell stories, they retain histories, they are like the public archivists of their communities. And these performance opportunities are more than simply entertainment, of course. They are history lessons, they are ways of maintaining tradition, as well as educating future generations on cultural pathways. Okay, pay attention to this vocal quality. Alright, what was going on there, right? I mean, this is polyphonic throat singing, where you're actually able to sing multiple pitches. It's a very interesting vocal phenomenon found in Central Asia, particularly in Kazakhstan and Mongolia, where you basically sing a tone so deeply in your vocal cords, and you open the cavity of your mouth up to allow for the harmonics of that pitch to resonate in your mouth cavity, actually creating multiple pitches. It's an absolutely fascinating phenomenon of using the voice. It's also pretty common in Lotus, actually, believe it or not. I think people in Bloomington really dig this kind of stuff. You can hear it right here. All right, we'll move on. Oh, here we go. Ayan Ali Bangesh is basically, straightforward Indian classical music, specifically on the sarod. Here's your opportunity to indulge in or experience a very virtuosic classical art music from southern India, as well as in a little bit of northern India, Hindustani India. You'll notice that this performance here is largely improvisatory, however based upon a melodic and rhythmic structural framework. In these performances, you judge the quality of the performance of the artist mostly by their ability to improvise on top of various melodic and rhythmic structures. Notice in both of these two sections we've talked about there's an absence of that booming bass. There's an absence of the pounding direct rhythm, but rather it's more nuanced, it's more melodic. These performances give you a great opportunity to kind of focus in on the virtuosity of the individual rather than the kind of dance party setting. Now if you notice here, both the percussionist on the tabla and the performer on the sarod, they're kind of musicking with each other, they're dialoguing with each other, talking to each other. Another one of the kind of contemplation type performances I'm talking about.
Unusual to see a zither in Indian music. Can you comment?
I can actually. So that zither is quite common in the Persian world and found its way through northern Pakistan. But you're absolutely right. It is quite uncommon to see a zither like that performed specifically in a South Indian performance. That one is called the santur, and it's a hammered dulcimer or a hammered zither. And in this case, it's used particularly for rhythmic accompaniment and harmonic accompaniment. It doesn't become a soloing instrument, but rather an accompanying instrument. That's a really good eye. In the same part of the world, we can talk about Rafiq Qawali. Take a look at the instrumentation here, too. Now notice we have the same kind of ensemble, right? The same kind of soloing and accompanying musicians seated in rows, one supporting the other. Notice their comportment on stage is identical. Qawali is a form of Sufi ritual music, found mostly in Pakistan. I'm sure you've heard of Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan. He's recently passed away, but was the world's greatest Qawali singer. These performers are kind of disciples of his, and they bring forth this devotional song, Sufi devotional song, which oftentimes can lead to ecstasy or trance-like states for its participants. And they do so in a more raucous environment. This isn't specific contemplation on the virtuosity of the soloing or the improvising that's going on, but rather more of an interest in the collective feeling or the collective enchantment is the word that's often used in the way that the singer interacts with the instrumentalists. So we have, of course, violin on the far left, and then does anyone know what this one is next to the violinist? It's a harmonium, which is a keyboard instrument that is, of course, powered by bellows. So he's pumping the bellows with one hand and playing with his other hand on the keyboard. And then we have percussion of various sites and then background singers. Now we move on to fusion. And fusion is my favorite, actually. For me, you come from Obits, but you stay for the fusion groups. Because this is where the really interesting stuff takes place, the kind of connections and collaborations that you wouldn't normally think of or even knew existed. This is where the groups really try to branch out, and you find musicians talking to each other across various boundaries in really interesting ways. Now, a lot of times these fusion groups are as a result of migratory mixing of communities. So one of my favorite groups, Delhi to Dublin, they arrived at, or they are a symptom of the very multicultural city of Vancouver, which has a very large Indian population as well as a Canadian population and as well as an Irish population. And these kind of cosmopolitan cities become petri dishes where musicians can really make these kinds of connections. It's the symptom of kind of the world we live in today, where people are moving around with greater fluidity than ever before. It's no wonder that you're going to have these kinds of musical connections and collaborations being made. There's a couple here I want to definitely talk about. Dole Foundation is one that I will not miss. I promise you that I will not miss Dole Foundation. They are the one to me that when I first read them, I was like, no, I'm not going to do that. That's just too much. And then after I started listening to them, I was like, no, wait a minute, they are onto something here. This is good stuff. So I'm going to play a little bit of one of their performances and then talk a little bit about where it originated from, or at least some of its constituent elements. Fast forward a bit. Okay, so we're kind of back to the main stage, aren't we? Okay, what just happened there? Did you catch that? Isn't that great? So we have a Celtic violin. I say Celtic because I can't specifically say where it's from, but rather it's from this larger repertory of Celtic music. A reel played on top of bongo percussion. And then we have this kind of pounding dance beat behind it. Later on, a harpist shows up. Now we're back again to the fiddle tune. This is going to go over very well in the lyrics. Three different kind of global pop musics layered upon each other with your pounding dance beat, the bongo drumming, and then on top of that the fiddle tunes. But how does that relate to what might be considered traditional bongo dancing? Listen to this beat. This is the bongo beat. Double-sided barrel drum playing this same rhythm over and over and over again. This is a very, very common form of dancing found at wedding celebrations in Punjab, an area of India. This is what you would call bhangra dancing as well. And notice it's just the drum. There's nothing else to it. It's just the drum. You have some chanting going on. But all of this music is based on that particular drum. Not just that drum, but that particular rhythm played on that particular drum. So the core of that drumming technique is you have in the right hand what might be considered a tek or a snare, and on the left hand you have a bass or what's called a doom. He's using mallets on both, but in playing them both simultaneously you hear polyrhythms take shape, where the lower doom strokes offer accents to the higher snare or tek strokes. But the entire rhythm is based on this anticipation, doom, tap, doom, tap, where there's an anticipation to the heavy doom stroke. Anywhere in the world, this is a bongo beat. And we bring it back, just for a second. I need to indulge this. You can hear that beat underneath, but it's not as pronounced, it's not as pure. Not only that, but in most Bhangra settings, you only have one percussionist, one Bhangra drum, because that drum is revered as the heart of the ensemble, the heart of the music. To have multiple Bhangra drums is unheard of in what might be considered more indigenous settings. This group has now got 5 of them on stage and they're dancing around. So I mean, you can already see that they're using this as a format for a kind of global popular music. I'm not going to miss that one, I promise. Some of the more interesting ones I found, we have 2 groups that are representing Israel at this year's Lotus Fest. And those 2 groups are really interesting in the sense that they both encompass a lot of the cultural diversity of Israel's Jewish population. So we have one group that kind of represents the Mizrahim, or the Arab Jewish communities, the Yemeni Jewish communities of Israel. And then we also have another group coming that represents the Sephardim, which is the more Ladino or Sephardic Jewish communities of Israel. And both of these groups are doing really interesting things in that they are within a global pop framework. As we've talked about some of these other groups, they're drawing upon a musical history of Israel that stretches beyond the Israeli state. So they're reaching back into the kind of cultural history of Israel to Jewish communities found outside of the Middle East, in particular Spain and Yemen. I'll start with here. This is Awa. So this is an Israeli musical ensemble, but you'll notice that they're singing in Arabic. Can you also hear a similar drum pattern there that we heard with the Bhangra? Now we have hip-hop beats, right? Fascinating thing about this group, and in particular the musical choices that they're making, is they're really digging back into the past and pulling up a Yemeni song tradition that often gets overlooked in Israeli mainstream culture. But yet they're revitalizing it with these kind of hip-hop dance beats behind it, and the electronica dance beats behind it. So they're actually, like I said earlier, the definition of tradition really is taking aspects of the past and recreating them in order to create a desired future. In this sense, we have this group reaching back into the past and pulling forth these Yemeni song traditions from previous generations who emigrated from Yemen into Israel, and then they're remaking them, revitalizing them with a contemporary pop music format with these dance beats. And then of course, hip-hop dancing, kind of b-boy technique, I guess. And then we have the imagery, of course, of the kind of Oriental Middle East. So what I really love about this group is they kind of bring to fore a lot of Israel's multiculturalism that we may not know much about or see very much of, certainly not in mainstream Israeli life, where the kind of Arab cultural roots of much of the Israeli population is often glossed over in favor of its more European-oriented roots. Here we have a group that's digging back into that cultural past and trying to make a claim for their revitalization in the present. As an example of that past that I'm talking about, this is an example of what that Yemeni song tradition is that I was talking about that they were drawing from. Notice the same kind of imagery, though, in the way that it's presented, desert-scapes, Oriental escapes. Same vocal technique. High nasal pitched voice in the back of the throat. High ornamentation. Same instrumentation of female voices. And this is the interesting part, harmonies. This is what really distinguishes the Yemeni Jewish community from the larger Yemeni or Muslim Yemeni community, in that in Arab music more generally there is no harmony, especially in vocal lines. But in the Jewish traditions found in the Middle East, and believe me, there are hundreds of different Jewish traditions found in the Middle East, they bring forth this notion of harmony in their performances. example of a kind of different kind of fusion, more of a historical fusion, rather than a geographic fusion taking place. Perhaps the most dramatic fusion that I found on the list, the one that really struck me as something I hadn't anticipated, was this group, Solo and Indra, which brings together Senegalese kora playing with Lithuanian zither playing. So we're thinking Senegal and Lithuania. How did that happen, right? I mean, you almost need a third party, it's like a third space in order for that kind of interaction to take place. But what's really interesting is what you realize is when you first start listening to this group, the instrumentation, once you hear the way that it's performed together, you think, oh yeah, of course, that makes perfect sense now. But you wouldn't think so, both culturally, linguistically, and geographically. But when you put these instruments on stage with each other, the connections are immediate and obvious. So pay attention to the kora in particular. And in this example, the zither is played as more of an accompanying instrument. One thing you notice about this instrument, it's a large calabash board that's played in between the performer's legs. And then the performer then uses their thumbs and index fingers, for the most part, to perform really intricate melodies and polyrhythmic lines. So you'll notice that there's a bass line, a kind of a mezzo line, and a soprano line all going on at the same time. And he's doing it all by interlocking his fingers together. The really fascinating thing about this instrument, though, is imagine we have a piano where each key that you hit on the piano goes up in a scale. On the kora, each of those notes alternates from right and left hand. So if you're going to play a scale on this instrument, you have to alternate right, left, right, left, right, left, which forces your hands to interlock with each other and to perform the melody in two hands. Similar to the Mongolian example, this style of performing is also part of a bardic tradition, where you have performers rehashing historical events, poetry, improvising stanzas for particular events. If I can fast forward a little bit, I can find that. There we go. So here we have the samples. This is a Lithuanian zither, a variant of the Arab kanu and the Turkish kanu. Now this instrument is set up just like a piano, where each string is lined up dramatically all the way up, and then you have levers on the side of the instrument that allow you to manipulate the tuning. And so it's played on top with the index fingers and thumbs. The thing that I notice is the way that these two instruments blend together so well. Not simply in their timbre or their sounds, but in the ways that they're being performed. You also notice that the vocal quality blends really nicely between the two performers. You can see on the right side the levers that I speak of that change the tuning of the instrument so that you can play different keys. Now, of course, my concepts, my abstract concepts that I came up with, there's a lot of blending between them, right? Some of the fusion would also be spectacle. This fusion would definitely be something in more of the contemplative mode. But the overlap to me is really fascinating, the way we see these different groups interacting with each other.
have any idea how those two came together?
I would love to know that story. Actually, Sunny might. Do you know?
Not off the top of my head.
That is something that I would definitely want to know when they got here, because to me, it seems like such an amazing collaboration, but yet not an obvious one when you first think of it. Why don't we stop there and let me talk about things? See if you guys have any questions. Yes?
Well, I'm quickly on the website, I've seen a Facebook encounter with Balkan beatboxers Tom Yosef.
Oh, okay, so we have an intermediary.
Kind of got that all going.
Okay, so
Isn't so often the case.
that makes perfect sense, because Balkan Beatbox, of course, an alumnus of Lotus, one of the big heavy hitters of global pop music, certainly aware of and intersecting with musicians from around the world, probably facilitated a mediation between them. The other thing is, I've often wondered what we might call the Lotus Effect is. So you come to a festival and you'll notice that a lot of the musicians you just saw on stage are standing next to you at the next group watching, hanging out, dancing, or they're backstage, you see them watching the other groups. You know they're hanging out afterwards, right? I'm not important enough to have tickets to those after parties, but Sunny can definitely tell us that these musicians and artists are probably all hanging out playing music together once the concert is over. The Lotus Effect, where these festivals create the collaborations, or at least facilitate the collaborations that then become new projects for other festivals. You know what I mean? There's also that Lotus Effect where you come home from 4 hours of this and your ears are ringing and you just have this smile on your face and you can feel the beat still in your body, and you lay down in bed and you can still kind of feel the vibrations from everything that you've experienced that night. That might also be a good Lotus Effect. So do you guys have any comments or questions? Anything you want to talk about? Are there any groups that you're really excited about seeing?
Dave, did you look at Femina at all?
Femina, the Ethiopian group?
No, they're from Patagonia, down in,
Oh, yes.
way down in South America.
There's a whole nother kind of category you might talk about, which is kind of the singers, the vocal heavy or vocal influence groups. There's some really great old-time American groups. Femina, the group that you're speaking of now, definitely really fascinating performative style that they're using. Do you know much about them, John?
I don't know too much. I think we're maybe helping to sponsor them, but yeah, they just, I don't know too much. They're singing in Spanish, so they're pulling out some traditional music from, the Spanish America. And some different rhythms. They seem to have a kind of a continent-wide perspective in the rhythms that they do.
When I was listening to them earlier today, I couldn't quite anticipate where they would be placed. Are they going to be in one of the inside events?
They'll be in one of the churches.
Yeah, one of the
Several
churches.
of the churches, actually.
You would almost have to have them in a church in order to really hear that kind of vocal blending that they do. Yeah. There's a lot of groups that I wasn't able to get to tonight that we could spend all night talking about. The group that I was raised listening to was Alton, and I'm so excited to be able to see them come to Bloomington. It seems like every year Lotus brings in a top-shelf Irish group or Irish set of musicians. And to me, that's always one of the highlights. Liz Carroll was last year, Solos not long before that. This year, Alton is going to be one of the highlights for me, but they've been around for so long, I figured that many of you had already heard them. I didn't want to spend too much time talking about them. Likewise with Movits. How many, is this 4 for Movits or 5?
It's either 3 or 4.
3 or 4. And they're great every time. Absolutely. I was telling Sunny when we were talking about this, they should really move to Bloomington, honestly, these guys.
They have told us that they are, at home they're a club band.
Right.
And so they have their biggest audiences in their hometown and in Bloomington, Indiana.
That's right. Who would have thought, a Swedish hip-hop group, they're celebrities in Bloomington, Indiana.
Wow. the throat singers, has there ever been anybody talked about having them do a workshop on how they do that? That would be really fascinating.
Wouldn't that be cool?
Yeah.
It's an interesting idea. Sonny, what do you think?
We've done it before in other contexts with other groups.
Yeah.
I know that, blanking on which group it was, did at the Archives of Traditional Music, did a singing workshop a number of years ago. It's definitely a fascinating style. It's really quite difficult.
It is difficult, because you think it has to do with your vocal cords, but it doesn't. It has to do with shaping your mouth cavity as you're singing. And that's where you have to basically take your tongue and move your tongue to the very back of your throat, and then you change the harmonics by shifting your tongue forward and backward. It's a fascinating vocal technique. Also very common in Central Asian, Mongolian, Kazakhstani Buddhist traditions as well. So I imagine you all took a look at the list of people coming. Was there anything that stuck out to you? Yes?
There's a couple of groups that I saw last year in Europe, which I'm really excited are coming to Bloomington. One of them is Herman Lopez from the Canary Islands. Amazing, amazing virtuoso timpani player. And the other is a brass band called Federspiel.
Yeah.
They're really fun.
Are they?
Yeah,
Okay.
really, you wouldn't believe what they do.
I spent some time listening to their, it almost seemed like a performance art piece. There was a lot of kind of, I didn't quite understand what was going on.
They do a lot of different things.
Okay.
I mean, they do a Mexican song, they do yodeling, like from the Austrian Alps.
Yeah.
And then they're all classically trained brass players. But they do they're really creative, really fun stuff.
Perhaps the biggest problem, if there is one, with the Lotus Fest is that you can't see it all.
Yeah.
And even when some groups are put on both Friday and Saturday, so you get the chance to see them, it's still, you can't see them all, and there's always something you feel like you're missing. It's almost a very Zen practice where you have to accept the musicians you see and let go of the ones that you miss. Otherwise, you can spend most of your day really frustrated that you weren't able to see everyone.
What's your strategy? Do you favor setting up in one place and hanging out, or do you favor jumping around a fair amount?
So I do a little bit of both, depending upon the context. There are some groups that I will sit and see, I want every note. I want to hear every single note. And there are others where you just kind of, I'm going to check this out for a minute, and then I'm going to hop over here on my way to there. But then I always end up at one of the main stages at the end of the night, you know, and that's usually when the night really gets going. It's those main stages, and that's where we spend most of our time. Would you say, Jess?
Yeah.
But early on, we're kind of hopping around. And finally, for the first time, my son is old enough to go with me. I was telling Sonny this. Have you ever tried to get a babysitter for Lotus? Seriously, I called 14 people last year and couldn't find one. 14. This is the first year where I think he's old enough to stick with us the whole night.
They were the movie show.
Yeah, exactly. Every conceivable possible opportunity for a babysitter, they're there. I don't blame them. Well, you know, I really appreciate everybody coming out tonight. I hope, if anything, was a bit of an appetizer for what awaits us with the festival coming up. If there's anything else you want to talk about, we can hang out. Otherwise, I just want to thank you guys for coming and listening to me roll on for a while.